Welcome to the Social Media Church podcast. My name's Aaron, if we've never met, and I am one of the co-hosts on this podcast. My other co-host, Nils Smith, is not here, but we are going to listen to an interview that was already recorded by Nils Smith. And I got to tell you, this is one of the most remarkable interviews. I actually can't believe that this interview happened. And it happened all the way back in 2013. This is kind of a milestone episode for the Social Media Church podcast. And periodically, I think this is the third time now that it will have aired on our podcast. But it's an interview between Nils, and I don't know how he pulled this off, but Nils is a man of many talents, and he got Gary Vaynerchuk to join him on the podcast way back in 2013. You heard that correctly. Gary Vee hopped onto the Social Media Church podcast with Nils Smith way back in 2013. And the reason we keep bringing this back is because we want to hear from you. Well, for one, let me back up. There's new members listening to our podcast every single month. And so you may have never realized that we started this podcast way back in 2013. It was actually started by a guy named DJ Chuang. He spoke at our conference this past year, and he will be speaking at our conference again this year. He's even been on a few different episodes of this podcast. But back in 2013, DJ started it and kind of passed it off to Nils. And this was one of the first interviews on the podcast. And so I would love to hear from each of you. And I know that Nils would also love to hear, how well does this episode hold up? Is this an episode that is completely irrelevant based on the things that were talked about in 2013? Or does it hold up? We would love it if you messaged us on Twitter. You can send us a DM on Instagram, or better yet, you can hop into our Discord server when this episode is done and tell us how well did this episode hold up. You can find all of those links in the show notes of this episode. And before you start listening, if you wouldn't mind, we would encourage you hit subscribe and let us know exactly how well does this episode from 2013 hold up. Here's Nils Smith and Gary Vaynerchuk.
Hi, I'm Nils Smith, author of the Social Media Guide for Ministry, and I'm here with one of my heroes, Gary Vaynerchuk, a New York Times bestselling author, social media expert, and future owner of the New York Jets. Gary, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the intro, brother.
All right. My crowd, Gary, is a church and ministry nonprofit leader. So when it comes to social media, where do you see the greatest opportunity in that area, and where do you see that we're really missing it?
Well, I mean, no matter what you do, whether you sell wine like me or it's for the church and ministry like your world, the fact of the matter is that it's all about storytelling, right? And as more and more people start spending more and more of their time on these platforms, your audience, people listening to this or reading this, interview, are going to need to understand how to get their message across on this platform. Much like, it's no different than for the people that are listening right now, thinking back to the mid-'90s when the conversation wasn't social media, the conversation was websites, right?
Yeah.
Could you imagine right now being a church or ministry or nonprofit and not having a website? Exactly. So that chuckle is the same way that I see people not having a heavy understanding of how to storytell on social networks.
And so, Gary, when it comes to all of the social networks that are out there, and so what I hear a lot is, I don't have enough time, and I'm busy.
Sure.
And then there's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google+, Instagram, Pinterest, and the list goes on. How do you prioritize your time, and how do you prioritize where you're investing that time with all the networks out there?
So for me, the reason, I think with Facebook, Twitter, depending on your business, then it becomes Pinterest, Tumblr, Instagram, LinkedIn, Google+. But the reason for me it's been very easy to focus on it and spend time is I was running a very successful business when this all pops for me in 06 and 07. A wine e-commerce business, as you may know, but some of the people listening might not. And the reason I was able to put a lot of time into it, hours and hours a day, is because I delegated a lot of the stuff that wasn't as important to other people. I would argue and challenge everybody on this call that they are spending at least 2 hours a day on things that don't matter as much, things that they're used to doing, things that they've always done, or really just leisure and not hustling enough. And they should put that into social and the people there, because I never understood how putting time and effort into the people that conceivably can change your business, the customer, was not a good idea. And your customer is living on these platforms.
Huh, that's good. So how do they? So a lot of people say, I'm not a storyteller. I'm not a communicator in that way. It's unnatural for me. How do you become a good storyteller?
At some level, it's a talent, right? So it's asking you, like, how do you become a good singer or a basketball player? You can definitely put in the work to be the best version of yourself, but you may need to hire somebody, if your best version of yourself still isn't great. And so, that's kind of how I think about it. I hire for the things that I'm not as great at, but, storytelling is something I am. And so, I don't, this is not some sort of rah-rah, you can do it, just read and try. You can get better. You can definitely become the best version of yourself. But you can only be the best version of yourself, and if your natural talent doesn't allow you to understand how to storytell or market, you need to then find somebody who does.
Very good. When it comes to, and maybe specifically in the church world or nonprofit world, but maybe in the wine world as well, what new technologies do you see coming down the road that you think those that are listening to this need to keep their eyes out on? Where should we be looking to focus our attention in the coming years?
I mean, if you're talking about a half decade, you got to look at Google Glass, right? The thought of people wearing glasses and having information. So imagine literally, the day when people are coming on Sunday morning and have them on, and as you're, if somebody's giving a sermon, literally there's information about it in their eyeglass because it's understanding the visuals. And you couldn't, or the audio eventually. And so just, that, the smart everything movement where all product is going to be smart, I think is going to be the biggest movement. So, literally to put into context of your world, imagine when the Bible is literally got information on it and your Bible texts you that you haven't opened it enough lately. I mean, it's going to really literally be that kind of world.
Yeah.
So, that kind of movement, I think.
That's awesome. That's exciting. Well, I do have one last New York question for you. Should Tim Tebow be the starting quarterback for the New York Jets?
So I think he's an incredible guy, and I know he's beloved in the community that's listening. So please don't get upset when I say I don't think so. But I think he's got a great chance to be president of the United States. I think that's a hell of a lot more. That's a hell of a lot more grand than being a quarterback in the NFL, right? So. That is my true, authentic, official answer.
Do you think he'll get a chance to be a starting quarterback anywhere in the NFL?
I do, actually. I think I think the New York stuff is tarnished and he needs a fresh start.
Right.
But I think he's limited as a passer, and but he just again, much like I think a lot of my stuff. I think my talent is fine, but I think I've willed myself to victory. I think he's got a little bit of that in him. I think he'll get another at-bat before it's all said and done. I don't believe the whole convert him to a running back or tight end. I think he's got too much bravado to let that happen.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Gary, I appreciate you taking the time and for leading the way with social media and bringing us along in the journey.
I appreciate it and wish you well.
All right, thanks, man.
Bye.
Well, what do you think? How well did that interview hold up? We want to hear about it. Again, you can send us a message on Twitter. You can Instagram, DM us. You can tag us in your stories. You can also hop into our Discord server, and I think that is going to be your best bet. There's more and more people joining with every episode, and it's a space where we're all learning how to use Discord together, as it is a relatively new platform, but it is a well-versed platform with the up-and-coming generation. And we also just want to create a space where the listening audience of the Social Media Church podcast can gather and learn together and discuss ideas. So hop into our Discord server, find the link in the show notes of this episode, hop in there and let us know how well did this interview that's almost 10 years old hold up today in 2020. So thankful for Nils getting Gary Vee on the show, and that same hustle and that same spirit is the same hustle and spirit we have all the way in 2022, getting as many people onto this podcast as we can so that we're able to add value back to you and your ministry. If you want to return the favor, we would encourage you hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. Your subscription and your review helps other people just like you find this content that will help them advance their ministry on social media. Thanks for listening to this episode, this special episode. Hop in that Discord server, and we'll talk again on the next episode.